Can everyone see everything okay? Thank you so much. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Crisis in Ukraine, Crisis in Washington. This is our second community forum from a series that started through the Wacom Peace and Justice Center Board of Directors President, Mateo, who thankfully spent his time to do a really thorough presentation about the role of NATO in this conflict and kind of ground us in a historical perspective around the position of the center and how to deepen our anti-war perception, right? So the community forum happened just 4 days after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and things were still moving. So now we're doing this follow-up panel where we can do a little bit more of intersecting our anti-war analysis, right? And like bring our questions since we've been reflecting and learning, and I guess feeling so hopeless by how many things have been happening over the last almost 2 months now. I would like to, my name is Aline Prata. I'm the director of the Wacom Peace and Justice Center. I'm joined here by some really amazing guests, and that includes y'all. So I just wanted to invite everyone to spend a minute introducing themselves in the chat. Things that you might consider are you know, what you hope to get from this gathering. Of course, your questions. I've compiled questions of my own based on what our community has shared with us over the last couple of months. But we definitely welcome live questions as well, and I will be paying attention on the chat with the help of our amazing board members and volunteers to make sure that your questions don't go unnoticed. You can also share any institutional affiliations that you might have, an email address if you want to be connected with folks in this panel, and again, any questions that you'd like our panelists to address. In case you were wondering, the song that I shared earlier is called Guerra by Residente, and I just pulled a quote that really relates to war and to our anti-war stance, and wanted to share with y'all today. I think it's important, and art has a role in reminding us that like learning to work for peace and social justice is not just something that we do in our brains, but also something that we do in our hearts and in our bodies, and that literally every day impacts people's lives and experiences. Art has this power, right, to connect us to that. So the quote says, "I kill war without shooting at it. War is afraid of hugs. War dresses with camouflage so that no one sees when it gets at it. War loses all of its fights. When enemies listen to each other, war is weaker than it is stronger. It can't stand life, so it hides in death." And just as an overview of this panel, after we do an intro to our panelists, they'll share each 7 to 8 minutes, like 5 to 8 minutes remarks, and we'll have a Q&A where we will deepen our conversation and, of course, take some time for action. As we progress through this webinar, I think it's really important to keep in mind that all of us, in one form or another, just like Mateo said in the last community forum, are standing in lands that have been home to indigenous people since time immemorial. In the case of the center, we are the land traditionally stewarded by Coast Salish people, Lummi, Lac-Timish, Sac people, and you know, just this fact alone tells you everything that you must know about our government's foreign policy and our stance on military occupations. Speaking of position and stances, I think it's important to ground ourselves with like some points of understanding and where we're coming from. If you want more details on that, you can accompany your work on social media, send me more emails for resources, and send us any other questions even throughout this panel. That this is an important space for that. But it's really clear for us that we condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine the same way that we condemn over the years several invasions and military occupations that have been led, funded, and supported by the United States and by other countries. We oppose the extension of NATO as a central issue to this conflict, and you can hear more about that through the link that we can share in the chat soon. And our sympathies and solidarity are, of course, and will always be with peace protesters in Russia and with people in Ukraine sheltering in Kiev subway. And ultimately, I think it's really important for us to remember the place from which we're speaking, right? Like we're speaking from a place of incredible privilege and incredible power and a really specific history. And that's where we should focus our time and energy on changing the institutions and the government that we are a part of. Lastly, our position is to request for negotiation and not escalation. Like our role is to not make the situation worse. We'll drop a link in the chat for a petition, so we'll have a little action sandwich, and in the end, we'll take some more time for action as well. But just reviewing our position: no war in Ukraine, Russian troops out, no nuclear war, no sanctions, no NATO, negotiations and not escalation, and welcome all refugees. So with that in mind, we selected this panelists, these amazing panelists and good friends and comrades to be here with you today. Zoltan Grossman is a professor of geography and indigenous studies at the Evergreen State College. He's also a longtime professional cartographer, and he shared with us earlier that he was redesigning and redrawing a lot of lines the Soviet Union collapse. So I think that gives you some insights on how much knowledge he has to share, but there's definitely so much more. Zoltan's studies and his activism are focused on intersections of ethnic nationhood, militarism, and natural resources from Native America to the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Welcome, Zoltan. Thank you so much for joining us. So great to meet you, especially this Samia Saliba is an amazing comrade, a great writer, a poet, researcher, and organizer, and you can tell my friend. She is also a WU alumni, and will begin her doctoral studies at USC in the fall, studying sanctions and impacts on women. Samia is also part of a Seattle-based Palestinian intersectional grassroots organization called Falastinyat, and she organizes to end the deadly. Our third and also amazing Bellingham-based gem is Villalba, who is a Bellingham-based educator, grassroots community organizer, and a mother of three. Sara works at WPSR, which is the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, as the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition coordinator, leading a lot of the efforts to move our resources towards restoring health and away from nuclear weapons. And without further ado, I will pass the mic to Professor Zoltan to start sharing his initial remarks, and we'll keep moving in the direction the order that I shared of the panelists. So Samia and Kyle.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity and for organizing this event. As a geographer, I don't think of Ukraine just as a piece on a geopolitical chessboard, but as an actual place with its own rich ethnic diversity. Ukraine means borderland, like the Southwest, a zone of mixture between two cultures. This map shows the swath of Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine in red, the far west Ukrainian-speaking region in yellow, and a mixed Ukrainian-Russian region in orange.
Professor Zoltan, I think you're muted. Let's just start from this next slide on.
Okay, did you get the first part? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, having some technical. There we go. Okay, can you see the presentation? Great. And I should start at the beginning, yes? Okay, great. Boy, that's so strange. As a geographer, I don't think of Ukraine as just a piece on a geopolitical chessboard, but as an actual place with its own rich ethnic diversity. Ukraine means borderland, like the Southwest, a zone of mixture between two cultures. This map shows the swath of Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine in red, the Far East Ukrainian-speaking region in yellow, and a mixed Russian-Ukrainian region in orange. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin began a policy of national self-determination to roll back the empire's great Russian chauvinism. Lenin detached part of Russia to give to Ukraine in 1922, now that Russian-speaking region. And Vladimir Putin still resents this because he sides with Stalin, who reversed that policy after Lenin's death. Between the world wars, the far west Galicia region around Lviv in yellow was part of Poland. In Ukrainian national consciousness, the first defining trauma was the Holodomor, or Great Famine, imposed by Stalin in the 30s, in which at least 4 million died. Because of this experience, some Ukrainians and some Russians initially welcomed the 1941 Nazi invasion, but not all, because about 3.5 million Ukrainians fought on the Soviet side in the war, the primary historical trauma in the region. Fascist leader Stepan Bandera's Ukrainian insurgent army had welcomed the Nazis and slaughtered Jews and Poles in Galicia to create a pure Ukrainian state. Bandera wanted to lead Ukraine as a Nazi puppet state, but the Nazis viewed all Slavs as subhuman and wanted their fertile land for German settlers. So Bandera's insurgents fought both the Soviets and the Germans, and they kept fighting, backed by the CIA, to 1952. After the war, Europe was divided between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO did not represent democracy since some of its members then and now are authoritarian, but it was a capitalist bloc to contain communism. And I remember being in Europe during the Euro missile crisis in the 1980s, during the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, which really showed the West's double standards. This is the map I grew up with of the 15 republics inside the Soviet Union that broke up in 1991 into 15 independent states. Ukrainians voted 90% for independence. They were recognized by Russia, gave up their nukes, and got security guarantees from Moscow. But at the same time, NATO expanded eastward into the former Warsaw Pact. New NATO bases were seen as a threat not just by Russian autocrats, but also by Democrats who preferred a neutral zone between NATO and Russia. In some ways, Putin and NATO need each other to scare their own people. The big question after the Soviet breakup was the 25 million Orthodox Russians left outside Russia. There were fears that they would want to separate and join Russia, but most did not. In Ukraine, about 17% of the population is ethnic Russian, concentrated in the Far East Donbass and forming a majority in Crimea in the south. These imprints of past history all shaped 21st century events in Ukraine, starting with the 2004 election. Keep in mind that language map of the Russian speakers in red, though remember that many ethnic Ukrainians speak Russian at home. And this divide is perfectly represented on the election maps, with the Ukrainian nationalist Yushchenko winning in the far west, the pro-Russian Yanukovych winning the east, and splitting the difference in the middle. Yanukovych also sold out to the rival empire of the United States by sending troops to Iraq. Yushchenko called for joining the EU and to bring the troops home from Iraq. After the Orange Revolution in Kiev's Maidan Square, he became president for 5 years, but tried to rehabilitate Bandera, which was very unpopular. In 2010, his vice president ran against Yanukovych and lost, but that east-west map was exactly the same. Both the candidates were magnates in the natural gas industry, which you can ask me about later. And Yanukovych took Ukraine in a very pro-Moscow direction, was incredibly corrupt and brutal. That stimulated a rise in Ukrainian ultranationalism, But even then, the far-right party only got 11% of the 2012 vote, almost all around Lviv, much lower than far-right parties in other countries. In 2014, a broad-based uprising against Yanukovych drew rightists and leftists alike back to the Maidan. About 30% of the protesters were far-right, and that means 70% of them weren't. I wrote an article warning at the time that, like in Afghanistan and Syria, the enemy of your enemy is not always your friend. I was disturbed by the fascist symbols, some from the global white power movement. The anti-EU party Svoboda wormed its way into the new pro-EU government. And the Nazi group Bright Sector provided some of the militant street fighters who drove Yanukovych into exile in Moscow. Even the US grew concerned about the armed Ukrainian fascists who have trained far-right militants from North America and Europe, enabling possible blowback. Russian far-right militants have also been training foreign mercenaries, and Putin has aided far-right parties throughout Europe. The fascists on both sides feed off of each other to reinforce their legitimacy. Putin took back Crimea after 60 years, using his easy victory and xenophobia to distract Russians from their economic crisis, very familiar to those of us in the West. Ethnic Russians in the industrial eastern Donbass also agitated for secession. The Russian armed militants' far-right politics was the mirror image of the Ukrainian ultranationalists. There was a moment of hope when Petro Poroshenko won all the regions on an anti-corruption platform, but he turned out to be very corrupt himself and went far to the right. And he began to coalesce far-right activists in the National Guard as the Azov Battalion, who could be a coup threat to democracy. For this reason, Congress banned aid to Azov, but the Pentagon has been ignoring that ban. The 2019 election was a rebuke to ultranationalists on both sides. Zelensky decisively won the Russian-speaking region, and Poroshenko only won the far-right stronghold around Lviv. So to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, it makes no sense at all that Putin's denazification would be directed against the candidate that they voted for in larger numbers than Ukrainian nationalists did. The war in eastern Donbass continued, killing about 14,000, mostly by shelling from both sides. And now after the invasion, most Western observers assume Putin wants to conquer the whole country. But even he knows that he'd face urban warfare, and an insurgency in the West would be supplied by NATO. The only thing for sure is his self-fulfilling prophecy. By invading Ukraine, he has elevated both the far right and NATO. I think Putin's endgame has been not regime change, but partition, to take back the Russian-speaking area of Ukraine that Lenin attached to it a century ago. He has called that swath Novorossiya, or New Russia. He wants to bite off that region rather than swallow the country whole. If you look at the language map and toggle it with Russian military advances, you see a perfect correlation with the red area. By massacring civilians in Mariupol, Putin is trying to build a land bridge from Donbass to Crimea and westward along the gas-rich Black Sea coast to Odessa and the Russian enclave of Transnistria in Moldova. Partition would be difficult because Russian speakers have not been greeting his troops with flags and flowers like Bush thought we'd get in Iraq, but with grenades and missiles. If a smaller rump Ukraine survives, Putin could continue to scare Russians with Nazis and NATO because his main goal is to control his own unhappy people and stay in power through fear. As we can see with the examples of British Ireland, India, and Palestine, and the US internal divisions of Iraq and Bosnia, partitions do not bring peace, but guarantee continued war for decades. If you look at these four maps together, it's clear to me that the multi-ethnic mixture of Ukraine is threatened by partition. I much prefer this solution, where the Ukrainian and Russian people, soldiers and civilians, join against war, which is not in their interests, and join to throw out their corrupt elites. These are some articles and sources that I'll put in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zoltan, so much for such a thorough presentation. Really appreciate it. I hope we can dig more into some of the material with the questions as well. I've been told that my voice wasn't showing up okay. Can y'all give me a thumbs up if you can hear me now? Okay. How about now? Sometimes it's with a problem with that. Okay. All right. I'm so sorry about that. Thanks for bearing with us through the tech issues. Great. Let's see. Next we have Samia. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Alini and to the Peace and Justice Center. I just wanted to say I'm really happy to be back, not physically back, but spiritually back with you all. The Peace and Justice Center was always an important space for me as a student activist at Western, and I haven't been back in a couple of years, so I'm really grateful to be invited. So I wanted to start off by saying that I'm not an expert on Russia or Ukraine or on the specific sanctions that are being imposed on Russia right now. I'm learning as you all are. But what I can offer is I research sanctions, and I'm pursuing a PhD to study sanctions. And so I can offer a little bit of context and insight on the impacts of sanctions, particularly the sort of comprehensive sanctions that we're seeing imposed against Russia, and what that might look like if those are imposed for a long period of time. And my case study, the research that I have done, is primarily on the sanctions against Iraq, which I think is a really important retrospective case, because it's in recent historical memory, and yet sanctions on Iraq are so often forgotten or kind of pushed aside, depending on how you view the invasion. And because of what happened since, we often don't discuss the violence of sanctions on Iraq. But I also think that it's an interesting comparison with what's happening right now with Russia, because I think it also indicates that sanctions don't always lead to the prevention of war, but instead weaken a country in preparation for war or invasion. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, sanctions were imposed by the UN kind of at the behest of the US from 1990 to 2003 in Iraq in response to the invasion of Kuwait, but specifically with regards to the assertion that Iraq was harboring chemical weapons. So again, there's some parallels with the situation with Russia, but obviously some differences too. So my specific focus in talking about sanctions in Iraq has been on gender. My research is on how sanctions affect women and the gender dynamics of sanctions as policy. So how they change gender dynamics and the expectations, the gender expectations in the target society, and how they reinforce gender violence. And in my graduate studies, I'm hoping to expand on this a little bit and look at sanctions in Latin America and sanctions across other axes of marginalization, but that is my specific area. So if you're asking me questions, that's where I know the most. But the two kind of main focuses of my work when I try to articulate it to people, and what I try to make sure that everybody understands, is that comprehensive sanctions like this are a form of violence, and I think they are a form of warfare, and they shouldn't be considered a non-violent alternative to sort of more traditional warfare. And secondly, that sanctions like this most directly harm those who are already marginalized in the target society, and rarely, if ever, have meaningful targeted impacts on the leadership responsible for whatever violence the sanctions are responding to, right? And so in this way, they often serve as a form of collective punishment. So sanctions research is very complex, and the impacts can often be difficult to quantify. But there are a couple of studies that I have looked into for my research that I think are important to touch on, which study the impacts of sanctions on human rights conditions, which can be a little bit nebulous, but what they generally show is that kind of across all human rights conditions, or like human rights metrics, sanctions lead to a deterioration of human rights conditions. And this is true for women's rights, which is what I looked at more directly, but it's also true for other sorts of human rights conditions like violence against ethnic minorities. And I think that this is also an important thing to point out, because sanctions are often justified in the US, specifically when we look at Iraq, but in lots of different contexts, as some sort of method of protecting human rights, right? We're often pointed to sanctions or to war as these are directed against these, violent states, these dictator states that are targeting ethnic minorities, or they're targeting religious minorities, or whatever it may be, or they're harming women. And there really just is not evidence that this is happening, that sanctions are having any sort of positive impact on human rights when we look at these sort of like sweeping imperialist sanctions that the US is enforcing in various places. For example, in Kurdistan in Iraq, Kurdistan was not the target of sanctions. Kurdistan is an ethnic minority region within Iraq, and it was a region that the US often talked about trying to free from Saddam's rule. But Kurdistan was still suffering both under US sanctions and under secondary sanctions from the Iraqi government. And those sanctions and that suffering in Kurdistan was not mitigated by foreign aid. There's lots of evidence that foreign aid did not really mitigate the effects of the economic violence happening there. And that's because the NGO industrial complex often places so many conditions on foreign aid that it becomes effectively useless. And also, aid cannot replace a functioning economy. And if sanctions have decimated a country's economy, there's only so much that foreign aid can do. But also that foreign aid is often very heavily conditioned. So my research on Iraq focuses on women, like I said, and looks at sort of women's safety and security and rights over the 13-year period of sanctions on Iraq. And what I found, which is not that surprising, but it is, I think, important, is that there was a decline in safety and rights for women across practically every category of life. So employment, education, family dynamics and autonomy within the family, safety in childbirth and motherhood, domestic violence, and violence against women more broadly. I looked at honor killings as well as violence against sex workers. So those are kind of the categories that my research covers. But Iraq is not a unique case, right? So countries that are experiencing this form of sanctions, it's not really surprising that sanctions contribute to such an increase in violence against women, against ethnic minorities, because we know that economic pressure and decline contribute to increases in domestic violence pretty much across the board. And so sanctions are a condition of forced economic decline, of forced economic pressure. And so it's again, not surprising that these are the cases, but these are stories that are so often not really told when we think about the impacts of sanctions, because they're seen as a policy that's targeting, the state. But the state is full of people who have no access to economic security under sanctions. And this brings me to my final point, which I really think is like what I want to drive home with this, is that in Iraq and elsewhere, what you see under sanctions is not a universal economic decline, but rather a stratification of wealth. So Saddam Hussein and the party officials of the Ba'ath Party and those with wealth and connections, including women who were wealthier, who were connected to the party, got richer during sanctions, while almost everybody else got poorer. And so sanctions are not targeting people like Putin, because the leadership of a country will always have the most access to smuggling, the most access to outside wealth, and the most access to hoarding of what limited resources are coming into the country. So sanctions target the poor, they target the marginalized, and they target political outsiders and dissenters. So that's what I want to end with. I'm happy to answer more questions about this, but those are my kind of main takeaways about sanctions that I hope everybody understands.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay this time? Thank you, Samia. I really appreciate such a true presentation. Tara, now I'd like to invite you to speak, please.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Alini. Thanks to the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center for Of course. Excuse me. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak with you today. My name is Tara. My pronouns are she and her. Before coming to WPSR to work to run the WPSR Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program, almost in another life, I actually studied nationalism. So I was really relieved and glad to hear Zoltan share about, I'm glad that there's more information about what the invasion means and the larger sort of nationalist context for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I'm here to talk to you tonight about some intersections with nuclear weapons. I'll go ahead and start. Let's see. Okay. Number one, I'm going to share 4 things and then 3 things. So just to help people keep track of the threads that I'm going to be sort of laying out a little bit. The first thread is that Ukraine is not unique. The invasion of Ukraine is not unique, and I'm sure that most people here understand that. Nuclear weapons owning countries invade non-nuclear countries so they can control their resources. We, the US, have done very similar things in the past, and even in the very recent past, also in the present. But I'm not going to go into that right now. Number 2, nuclear weapons. I believe nuclear weapons are born out of fear. These particular generation of nuclear weapons, they were born out of fear of being dominated. US scientists were worried that if Germany got the nuclear bomb first, that they would dominate the rest of the world with a weapon that no one can defend against. Thing number 3, nuclear weapons continue to be a weapon that no one can defend against. There is no defense, there is no health system in the world equipped to handle the fallout that would happen if even one nuclear weapon was detonated. None. We saw in the last 2 years how woefully our public health systems handled a microscopic virus, and how many poor people and people of color were disproportionately affected just because of all the other systems that exist outside of our public health system. There is no health system in the world that can handle a nuclear war. What happens after a nuclear war? The only way to really handle it is to prevent a nuclear war. Thing number 4, creating and let's see. I got really emotional when I wrote this. So if I start sounding emotional, just go with it. It happens in this line of work. Number 4, creating and maintaining nuclear weapons is very, very costly. And I don't just mean money. Washington State knows the cost of nuclear weapons productions firsthand. The making of nuclear weapons required the displacement of indigenous people, the extraction of uranium, the coercion of humans to be a cheap labor source. Some of the people, the first people to pay the cost of the nuclear weapons production were the Wanapum tribe and other tribes that were displaced, and other settlers also who were displaced, to build the Hanford complex. The Spokane tribe, whose territory was sacrificed in order to mine uranium. We tested the first ever nuclear weapons on the people on the Tularosa Basin. The first people who experienced the devastation of a nuclear weapons explosion experienced it just days before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's in Tularosa, New Mexico. Today, the waters and forests around the Midnight Mine in Spokane are contaminated. And today, the land and waters around Hanford hold the most nuclear waste in the Western Hemisphere. Today, people who experienced and their children and their children's children who first experienced the first ever nuclear explosion on our planet are dying from radiation exposure without recognition or compensation. This is what it cost for the US to be the most dominant country in the world. This is the cost of that. A just transition is supposed to be about moving away from an extractive economy and instead building a regenerative economy that can support people and the planet for generations to come, so that the generations after us, not just of humans, but of every living creature on our planet, can thrive. That's the point of a just transition. The US nuclear weapons industry carries inside it all the components that have caused the existential crisis that we find ourselves today in. In order to make these nuclear weapons, the US military and its related industries in the private sector are the largest consumers of fossil fuels. And bloated militaries, whether it's Russia's or the US's, wage wars to control fossil fuels and to control this story about themselves. What can we do given that this is a situation we are in today? The first thing is at least I'll speak for me as a nuclear abolitionist, we have to put guardrails on the nuclear weapons that already exist so that they will never be used again and so that they can be dismantled and the radioactive waste that they have created can be stored safely until they are no longer harmful and lethal. And to give you an idea of what kind of a system we need to create, those radioactive wastes remain radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. That's the system we have to create, and it doesn't exist. There are examples of how WPSR is just one of many organizations that are supporting local efforts to pressure our federal government to commit to never again detonating nuclear weapons and to change the culture that says that it's okay to pay the price that is required to be, quote unquote, the most dominant nation on earth. The second thing that we have to do is we must not allow for a new generation of nuclear weapons to be created and produced. The invasion of Ukraine and the rising dominance of China, economic prosperity of China, are both being used to justify building a new generation of nuclear weapons so that the US can maintain its dominance across the world. We have the opportunity to be the generation of humans who block this new generation of nuclear weapons. And the third thing is that we have to repair the damage that was already caused from the first generation of nuclear weapons. There are many action alerts and opportunities to plug in with the Washington Physician for Social Responsibility's Nuclear Abolition Program and with the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition, of which the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center is a member. So if you are interested in this work, there are ways for you to plug in. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to having a discussion with you all.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much for bringing it home. You know, I think especially for younger generations, we expect us to really fully grasp with the impact of nuclear weapons, and having lived with it for their entire lives, it's just like bringing everyone together and understanding the impact that it has materially in our region. I think is something that's important. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Okay. Here we go again. All right. How about now? Mildly better. Okay. This is what we have for today. I was just thanking Tara for bringing it home, for connecting the thoughts. I think what I'm gonna do now that we're entering this Q&A and forum part of the talk is to go over a couple main questions that I had, at least for each one of the panelists. And of course, I'll continue to collect any questions. I see that someone has already dropped a question in the chat, and hopefully we'll get to them after I ask these first three questions, and we'll have a little bit more time for discussion after that. Let's see. I think I wanted to start with Samia. One question that we got a lot, Samia, and of course, any of the other panelists are also welcome to chime in. Drop your thoughts in the chat if there's specific resources that you want to share with the community, and that's true for everyone else too. So, Samia, the question that I had for you was just, if we care so much about the suffering of people in Ukraine, but we're not doing sanctions and we're also not sending guns, what should we do?
Yeah, I think that my answer might not be the most satisfying on this, but it is from my heart, my answer. I think that there is often this push on organizers, on anti-war activists, to always have an alternative solution to these like really complex situations. I've seen that a lot in discussions of Syria, of Palestine. Well, if you don't advocate for this, what do you advocate for? And I think that is often really disingenuous, and it's like, I don't mean that it's necessarily intended that way, but I think that sometimes the impulse is kind of unfair, that everybody has to know what should be done in order to say that they think something is wrong. And like, I study a lot of IR policies, like international relations policies, but I'm not a proponent of most approaches to international relations. I think that they're built within and by a system created by imperialist war powers that want to promote war. So many of the options that we have, many of the bodies that we have internationally are not going to save us, right? And I don't have to know what we need to replace it with to say that that's true. But I think that there are also ways that we can work within our communities and within ourselves to try to pursue justice and international peace and whatever it may be that we're seeking. And my real answer to this question, even though it may not feel very urgent or very satisfying, is I think that what the best that we as individuals can do is build relationships internationally with communities that are impacted by imperialist violence, right? And then try to strategize with them about how we can have the most localized and material impacts and take guidance from those communities. So a lot of my own organizing work is around Palestine. And in my Palestine work, what that looks like is doing work to stop global trade from Israel in Seattle, or working on local campaigns to end SPD's police exchanges with Israel, right? Those are material impacts that are local. And within global networks of people doing that kind of work, there's much more impact, right? It gets compounded. With other global struggles, that might look like learning how you can sponsor and directly support refugee communities. I don't think that there's one good answer, but I really think that we have to kind of reimagine how we're approaching this question about what can we do? Because there's a lot of things that we can do, but it might not, as individuals, we aren't going to end anything. And I don't think we have to have the end goal in mind in order to see when things are not the right approach, right?
Great answer, Samia. Would Professor Zoltan or Tara want to add anything to that question?
Tara, go ahead and.
Sure. I would what can we do? We can and are already giving humanitarian aid. We can and already are saying that the treatment of refugees should be the same across the board, that refugees, no matter where you're coming from, need to be treated in a dignified way, and to call for a stop in arms transfers. Because I don't know how many people in here have studied or been part of wars, but anytime that a contribution is made in a war to help bolster up one side so that it can fight the other one better, it means one thing. It means the war lasts longer. And a war reaching a state of equilibrium is the biggest problem that there could be, because it means that more people are dying at that stage. What we really want to call for is negotiations and a ceasefire immediately.
Yeah, I would agree that what we really need to look for in policy is consistency, and to expose these double standards when they are brought up. You know, a lot of the online debate about Ukraine in the last month has been between a bunch of folks who feel like Russia's in the right and Putin can do no wrong, and then another group of people who feel that NATO is purely defensive and it can do no wrong. But I have some hope, I think, in the majority of people who have been really woken by this particular war. For a lot of younger people, this is their first, well, in the United States, this is their first exposure to a major war. A lot of my students were born after the Iraq invasion and have no memory of the terror of nuclear war. And so I feel that some of the people who have been genuinely horrified by the humanitarian catastrophe can and will extend their sympathy for refugees to Hondurans and Haitians, or to Yemenis and Afghans and Palestinians. And I think we need to be working with those people to try and educate them about war, about US foreign policy, how it's really not that different. The US has bombed a lot of hospitals in various wars. There's a whole list of those. And I think also that the real danger of nuclear war is coming not just from Putin's possible use, but the US introducing a whole generation of tactical nuclear weapons that narrows the threshold between large conventional weapons and smaller nuclear weapons, making it much easier. It was the US that really started that process. And the huge global movement in the 1980s against the Cruise and Pershing II missiles and the SS-20 missiles from the Soviet side that really focused attention on the nuclear terror from both sides. And that brought together, there were people in the Western Shoshone and others who've been fighting nuclear testing in Nevada came together with people from Kazakhstan who were fighting the Soviet nuclear testing. And I think it was called Semipalatinsk, now Same in Kazakhstan. And so, you know, to have that kind of international solidarity between people who are against the idea of empire, not just against one empire and in favor of another empire, but are kind of sick and tired of the whole idea of empire in its totality, and knows how this is leading these people towards, you know, losing their families and the rest of us to the possible end result of chemical and nuclear weapons being used. And so we really need to educate people that, you know, these things that happen abroad affect us at home, and what happens at home affects what happens abroad.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just add something. Thank you, Sultan, for saying something about quote unquote low yield nuclear weapons, or what's called tactical weapons. The smallest quote unquote low yield. There's no such thing. First of all, I just want to be clear. A nuclear weapon is a weapon of a totally different magnitude. The smallest nuclear weapon, quote unquote, a tactical weapon, is 200 times bigger than the Moab, the mother of all bombs. That's the kind of difference we're talking about. There's no such thing as a small nuclear weapon.
And Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Forces Agreement in 1987 under pressure from this huge global, there were 1 million people on the streets in New York for a nuclear freeze, and huge numbers in Europe for the withdrawal of those missiles. And that was attained. And that treaty, the INF treaty, was ripped up by Trump. And I think a demand of our anti-war movement, in conjunction, perhaps with the anti-war movement in Russia, is to reinstate that treaty, to at least step away from that brink.
Thank you all for your contributions to this question. I'm going to move on to another one, but of course, totally related, right? You all brought it up, this question of historical memory, right? So one of the questions that we got a lot, some of our neighbors and some of our friends, and even people in the vigil that we co-hosted with WPSR, community and other organizations, was this question on isn't NATO defensive? So after all, what was NATO? What is NATO currently? And how has that changed over time? So kind of understanding what this means in the current moment. I also see that there's a related question in the chat, so I wanted to open up with this one. I know we talked extensively about that with Matteo in the last meeting, in the last community forum, but I wanted to give a refresher. Maybe Professor Zoltan, I think you'd be a great person to answer that question, and if others want to add to it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think NATO, I mean, there was a time in the late 80s, early 90s when the Soviet bloc was collapsing, when there was, kind of a vision emerging from the campaign for nuclear disarmament, from Gorbachev himself, of this idea of kind of a common European home from the Atlantic to the Urals, that, military alliances would no longer be necessary because you don't have two superpowers facing off against each other. And instead, the U.S. chose the path of NATO expansion. Even at the time, some of President George H.W. Bush's advisors, Scowcroft, I think, a few of the others, George Kennan, who was actually the formulator of the containment policy to surround the Soviet Union with bases, thought it was incredibly provocative and endangering the nascent, at least formal political democracy emerging in Russia, because it would strengthen the hand, as it did, of Russian ultranationalists. And Putin is not drawing on a tradition of socialism or communism. He's drawing on a pre-Soviet Russian imperial vision. And that has been strengthened by this idea of a threat from the West. And he's also used the threat of Islam, of Islamist movements and Chechnya and Syria to kind of recreate this threat from the South, which goes very deep in Russian nationalist consciousness as well. And so the idea of going right up to the Russian border, and some of the nations like in the Baltics that have a history of conflict with Russia, some of them welcome NATO, and some of them saw the possibility of great tension emerging. And I think that the war in Ukraine, while not directly tied in the moment to NATO expansion is definitely one of the factors that's been fueling this Russian ultranationalism that Putin has grabbed hold of. And to try and say that increasing NATO expansion is going to somehow contain Russia this time, when it hasn't, prevented a war against Ukraine, in the past 20 years, is really to be asking for more trouble rather than less trouble. And so I worry about that. I worry about some of the weapons that are floating around that are going to end up in different hands than are intended. And so we could see, the emergence of military conflict in this region for a long time because of how this is being handled.
But I see you'd like to add something to that answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to preface this first by saying this is not WPSR's analysis. This is me myself, just to make it clear and not pull WPSR into this analysis. But I think that NATO is the military force of Western European capitalism, of basically the European Union. That's the function of NATO and what it has morphed to now, for sure. It has all the same sounds now as well of US dominance. It's sort of a vehicle that the US can impose its dominance in Europe because it is the biggest nuclear power. So how does that sound in particular? It's sounding like Europeans asking not only to get into NATO, but also to have new nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. Those are sort of hallmarks of how military partnerships work.
Yeah, I'd really agree that NATO has more to do with a continued US role in Europe. I think Henry Kissinger always identified the fear of an independent Western European military policy, as France was pursuing, for instance. I really don't think it has a lot to do with democracy, because Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey at various times were right-wing dictatorships. Poland and Hungary, which are now authoritarian, are still part of NATO. And you only have to see what happens when it's the other way around. When Mexico was, during World War I, it was feared that Mexico would ally with Germany in World War I. And that was one of the factors in a US invasion of Mexico. 1916-17, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet missiles were stationed in Cuba. So under the Monroe Doctrine, the US doesn't allow neighboring countries to be part of rival military alliances. In the sense, why would Russia, in that way? I mean, the US has participated in this great power, brinkmanship and, control of spheres of influence, and yet is denying that to other countries. And so, when going back to the question of what can we do, it's to have our policy be consistent and to, follow what we preach other countries should follow, and to set that example instead of being the bully in our neighborhood, and Russia pointing to that as an example of what it should do in its neighborhood, or China doing the same with Taiwan or the South China Sea, to set the norm that perhaps you shouldn't be interfering in your neighbor's affairs and constantly intervening. That would be the primary way that we as Americans could contribute.
Great. Thank you so much for ending this conversation. I guess my next question is to Tara then. Tara, this week is Earth Day, right? And I'm just thinking a lot about what you brought up, which is this more holistic approach to climate justice and environmental work. What does that look like, right? So here's a question that I think kind of connects a lot for us, right? Who's benefiting and profiting from this war? And what are some of the costs and consequences of it continuing? I know that some people have noticed their oil cost is higher, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit more on
Thanks, Alini. So I will take the first part of that question later. I'll just right now I want to say who's paying for this. And I know Americans overwhelmingly said we will pay more for gas if it means that that Russia will stop invading Ukraine. But the reality is the supplies from Russia have not fallen yet. We are still being supplied with fossil fuels. So the rise in gas prices seem like it's connected, but ask questions about what that really means, because the rise in prices now is not reflected by supply. It doesn't bear out. The supply hasn't gone down yet. And yet we're already getting charged for it. So this inflationary thing is on one hand, very speculative. That's the way our economy works. And that's a problem. The second thing is Ukraine is a breadbasket, as many have pointed out. They may not supply the United States because we grow wheat as well, right? But one of the groups of people that Ukrainian wheat and Russian agriculture supports are many of the UN food programs. So when countries like Ukraine get into agricultural trouble, whether it's because of climate change or it's because of war, the most impacted people are the people who had nothing to do with the conflict, often refugees, often people who receive food aid, because that's where the wheat is coming from states who produce a whole lot of wheat. So there's a lot of impacted people who will be impacted. Like those impacts haven't shown up yet in the exports. The exports haven't changed yet. Supply hasn't changed yet, but it will, because war devastates fields. That's a thing. But again, these changes in prices have not been borne out by the changes in supply yet. On the other hand of your question, who is benefiting? So one of the things that I want to share is, let me see if I can grab the link really quick here. This article shows that oh no, sorry, I'll just tell you. I'll put the link in a minute, but basically that US defense companies, their stocks are soaring. Northrop Grumman has made around 20% a rise in their profits. So has Lockheed Martin. So has Boeing. So some of the corporations that are benefiting the most from the use and the sales of nuclear weapons are those corporations. Those are also the same corporations that have already been contracted to build the new generation of nuclear weapons for the US. So they are already making a killing off of this war. And we're not even talking about the war that the US wants to start with China. That's not even part of this calculus yet, but it should be, because these corporations and these defense industries are very set on making a new generation of nuclear weapons. That's the cost we all have to pay. We have to pay for it because the money that's getting paid to these defense contractors is taxpayer money. Nobody wins except the defense contractors.
I'd have to say there's one other winner, and that's the fossil fuel industry. Not just because of the natural gas pipelines that are taking Russian gas through Ukraine to Europe, and Russia, paying trying to avoid paying for some of the tariffs and rerouting and finding alternate routes. Also, Ukraine being very, very rich in natural gas deposits, in particular along the Black Sea coast, where we're seeing most of the fighting now, in the Donbass. And so, you know, this is partly a resource grab, as we've seen in the Middle East and other parts of the world. It's just happening in Europe this time. And the idea that somehow we need to drill for oil and gas to be energy independent is just giving a shot in the arm to the fossil fuel industry, just at a time when it's the most threatened by renewable energies and by a strong movement, climate justice movement around the world. So that's the other that's the other sector that's doing very well over the past month, and refocusing policies of Western governments.
I have a bunch more questions for you, but I think I'm just going to ask one more that I want all of you to respond, and then we'll move into questions from the audience. And I think that one of the questions that is really hard to address when we're talking about the sport is just like, how is the media isn't covering a lot of those things, right? Like, especially the history of NATO, all of these like more complicating factors to this war. And also to other wars and other histories that are being erased, you know. So I guess my question is, there's a pointness to Samia around like how the media is covering issues or not covering issues on Palestine this week, but also at large, just like this question of where do you recommend people get their information about this issue? What platforms do you use? What platforms do you not use? And, you know, the hypocrisy of this moment, I think there's a lot there too. Samia, would you like to start? And you don't need to comment on the whole question, but more on this issue of Palestine as well. I think you have a lot to say on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I have long ago stopped paying any attention to, not paying any attention, but stopped getting any sort of meaningful information from US media about what happens in Palestine, because the portrayal is just so consistently, I mean, you just see it playing out in the same ways over and over again. It's passive voice, Palestinians died. How did they die? How many, you know, what was the circumstances, right? Like, or it's always portrayed as clashes. It's always portrayed as both sides. I mean, it's just so predictable how the media portrays it. And I think that it has been, as somebody whose work primarily revolves around Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, it has been really frustrating, and it has been really upsetting in our communities to look at the difference in, I would say, both the media portrayal of the situation in Ukraine compared to the media's portrayal of Palestine and of other crises like Syria. But also to look at how the public has responded and how easy it is for people to uplift people in Ukraine fighting against imperialism, rightfully so, but how different that is from the way that people treat Palestinians fighting against settler colonialism and imperialism. And so I urge everybody to think about that, to think about, as we're seeing an escalation of violence this week, which is not uncommon in Palestine during Ramadan. As we're seeing this escalation in violence, I urge you to really pay attention to the difference in the way that the media is covering that compared to how it's been covering the crisis in Ukraine. And I urge you to find better news. And I can't say necessarily where I've been finding like super great information about Ukraine. I think that what I take to heart and what I recommend for people, both in learning about Ukraine and in learning about Palestine and other crises, is that for me, the most important piece is to surround myself with a community that has a strong anti-imperialist approach and that has kind of international connections to movement workers across the world. And for me, with Ukraine, that has been the International League of People's Struggles, ILPS in Seattle. There have been like really strong analyses in that space where we could like process, when we were getting like pretty limited information right at the beginning, like, what should our stance be? Like, what should we think about this? Like, we don't support this, we don't support this. So I think the most important thing is to surround yourself with community and try to build connections internationally. I get a lot of information from social media. I know that it's not always the most reliable, but again, I think if you have like communities that are there to help you process that information and to analyze things, that I think it becomes clearer. And I think my ultimate advice is just don't get all your information from one source, and don't get all your information from only American sources.
Great, Sada, Sultan. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd say, some of the activists that have been doing work for years in solidarity with people in Central and Eastern Europe are out there. And there is not a very large Central or Eastern European left, but it is there. The Barricade is a really interesting source that you can access via Facebook. It's a really enlightening book for me. Yulia Yurchenko's Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, Marketization, Armed Conflict is one. This is a little bit about the Barricade. And so there's a whole community of people who have either lived in the region or see the nuances and don't feel that it's a choice between supporting NATO on one hand or supporting Putin on the other hand, that there are third, fourth, fifth kinds of choices to make, and based on the local realities, on the real histories of those countries, rather than them just being proxies or pieces on a chessboard for somebody else. I'd encourage you. I use a lot the historical atlas of East Central Europe to see some of these border changes. Somebody could have lived their life in one village in Western Ukraine and actually been part of 5 different countries. That's how much borders have changed over the past century. And so to really look at those local nuances and those knowledge from people who have either lived in the region or have family ties.
For me, for US news, I know it's very left-leaning. It's not 100%, it's not foolproof, but the Black Agenda Report, The Intercept, Democracy Now!, and then make sure you have international sources, like Samia said. Al Jazeera is one. And there are other international papers. I personally read papers from the Philippines because I know better the histories of those newspapers. And so I read what they say about the same exact issues here that we talk about in the United States. And so if you have access to any kind of media from other countries, that's a great place to go as well. And then the thing I would say is really get involved. If you get on the Walk in Peace and Justice's social media accounts and their email list, then anytime WPSR or the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition sends out news alerts or action alerts, it goes through that. And so it's a really handy way for people to get informed about things that you would have a hard time finding information for, like the president's budget request and what the nuclear budget request is for 2023. It's hard to find that information, mostly because it's classified and you're not supposed to know. But if you are part of the movement to abolish nuclear weapons, that information is really easy to get, because we can't stop ourselves from talking about it. So, get involved.
These are such wonderful questions, answers. Can you all hear me this time around? Oh my goodness. Sorry again. Okay, how about now? Is that better? Okay. Thank you all for your answers. I totally agree with the having multiple sources, having sources from the Global South if you can. I had a question about Global South approaches versus North, but we're not going to get there. I'm deciding now to open it up for questions from the audience. If you can either raise your hand or add something to the chat, I'll get to your question. I see Hugh, you raised your hand.
Do you think we'll ever get a conviction on war crimes for Putin? I mean, they should just pick a few and charge them one or two. And
What's interesting about this
The
is
quick
neither
conviction.
Russia nor Ukraine is a party to the International Criminal Court. It's interesting. The United States has also been very much opposed to some of the provisions of the International Criminal Court in case some of its officers would have been taken in by either the Iraq or Afghanistan, where there's actually a provision in one of the laws that the US has the right to go into the Netherlands to rescue anyone who is brought to any American who's brought to the ICC. The US has also weakened the Genocide Convention and fears that it would be used against itself. And so I think I don't see a realistic option for Putin in particular to be brought in war crime, or even for him to be necessarily overthrown in some kind of an uprising. I think it's much more likely to see some kind of internal coup situation, as happened with Khrushchev in 1964, that happened temporarily to Gorbachev in 1991, August of 1991, where some of the national security bureaucrats around Putin see him as a greater liability. That's not happening right now, but with the losses that are happening in Ukraine and with the increasing isolation of some of the oligarchs, there could be a shift and would probably happen internally. That being said, I think the growth of the Russian anti-war movement has been a great thing. These people have been taking huge risks by going out and demonstrating, and we should, one of the things that we can do actively is to support people in the Russian anti-war movement. Many of them, and in Ukraine, were against the US war in Iraq and are being consistent and opposing what their own country is doing in Ukraine.
I think that answers it very well. Does anyone else have another question? Just raise your hands or use the raise the hand button under reactions in your actual face, or you can do it in the bottom of the screen to the right. I'm wondering if you're hearing me. Okay, the bottom of the screen to the right, there's a button where you can click reactions and raise your hands and ask questions, or you can actually raise your hands, or you can drop them in the chat. But thank you, Professor Zoltan. I think that answers it really through and through. All right. Okay, I want to thank you all for being here tonight so much. Before everyone leaves, I wanted to plug the center, but I appreciate Tara just did that work for me, so I don't have to do it again. But once again, follow the center, follow WPSR, follow the work of Professor Zoltan. and Falastinyat, and the PDX and the Seattle Police Department exchange, the deadly exchange. I want to invite all of you to drop actions, petitions, sign up to newsletters, websites here in the chat, especially Para, Professor Sultan, and Samia. And I want us to take a minute to just do a quick action in 5 minutes before we close up. And Mateo, would you be willing to just do that real quick? I'll share the slides and so that everyone can see, and we'll be on the call just for consistency, continuing to advocate for de-escalation and de-escalation and negotiations. Here. All right.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. The action was posted earlier in the beginning. We like to post it again. The most important thing that we can do is constrain our own government. And there's a petition that we're going to put in there from the American Friends Service Committee, who do a lot of work with lobbying, with that sort of stuff. We've partnered with them in the past. And they have a call to, it's a very easy form. It sends it to all of your elected representatives in Congress, asking them to not continue to escalate the situation in Ukraine, that the answer must be negotiation and not more weapons exchange, more weapons transfers. So we encourage everyone to take that as a first step, and maybe develop a relationship with your Congress people, and consider that the most important action that maybe you can take is sharing that petition with someone else. Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, they have thousands of dollars at their disposal. What we have at our disposal is numbers, as much numbers, as big of numbers as we can collect, right? If everyone here fills out that petition, that's a sizable percentage increase for our local congressional district. If you pass it to someone else, that increases even more. So I wasn't following the chat here, but we'll post it here again. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Mateo. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. Y'all were amazing, and thanks for participating and asking questions. The center is, again, always here as a resource, both for building community for peace and social justice, and also to offer you resources and answer your questions and connect you with people that can, if we can't. So thank you again, and stay connected. Peace and solidarity. Good night.